ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm Mark Blunden, and this is The Leader. I'm in West London's Kensington Square, where the last freehold house sold for over £9 million. But I suppose it does have 4 bathrooms, But a typical home in the capital now costs nearly 10 times the average income. Surging house prices reduce affordability to the lowest level on record. It comes as the latest nationwide figures show London's house price growth has slowed slightly, but with hybrid working and the COVID-era race for space still driving many people's property buying decisions, is it still possible to bag a relative bargain inside the zones? Research from one big estate agency shows a typical flat in Zone 2 costs over £610,000, but in Zone 4, a similar property cost about £364,000. And we've got a few hot tips for you, courtesy of Homes and Property editor Prudence Ivy, who'll be speaking with us later. But first, to discuss the latest house price data and economic factors driving prices, we're back in the studio and joined by the Evening Standard's business editor, Jonathan Prynne. Jonathan, what property news are you reporting on the business pages today?
So we've got latest figures for June and indeed the second quarter from the Building Society nationwide that publishes one of the most reputable house price indexes. And what they're showing is that London house prices continue to rise at quite a decent pace, 6% a year. But that rate is slowing. It had previously been over 7%, and we're gradually seeing the heat coming out of the London property market.
And what's your take on why this is?
Well, bear in mind we've had 5 interest rate hikes now since December. That's definitely started to have some impact on demand for housing or demand for buying homes. And just generally the slowdown in the economy and the fact that families are feeling so squeezed by the cost of living and inflation, I think all of that has just started to take steam out of the property market, not just in London. In fact, London is one of the slowest growing regional market, but nationally you're starting to see a slowdown happening now as well.
Could you expand a bit on the economic factors driving these very high prices?
Despite all the bad news about the state of the economy, we still have full employment. It is absolutely remarkable that pretty much anyone who wants a job can find one. There's very little what you might call involuntary unemployment. People have jobs, and while people have jobs and they're getting well paid, they can service their mortgages. Interest rates are a lot higher, but bear in mind that the Bank of England's headline rate is still only 1.5%, which in any sort of historical context is still remarkably low. You can still get 5-year fixes for 2.5% or so. It's remarkable. So I think until those two factors materially change, until we see unemployment starting to rise significantly, and until interest rates start heading sort of north of 2% towards 3%, which is quite likely, I guess, in the latter part of the year, then we certainly won't see anything like a collapse on the scale of what people might remember from the 90s or even during the global financial crisis. Things will probably just steadily slow down. But, there's always a buyer for London property. It's a global investment market.
But of course, there's a huge disparity between wages and property prices. Is there any hope of a correction?
Well, it's the great conundrum of the London property market, isn't it? Prices keep on rising faster than wages, and yet, the market sort of very rarely has a significant fall. So it is getting increasingly expensive for most what you might call ordinary Londoners. But there's always been, increasingly in recent years, there's always been an international investment element to the London property market, and that's sort of underpinned it. But you're right, it is increasingly unaffordable for the vast majority of Londoners, and it's hard to see what can be done about that, simply because they're not building any more London, as it were, and the land that London stands on is increasingly sort of densely built over. So short of sort of going into the green belt, it's hard to see how really significant numbers of new homes are going to be created in London on the scale that's needed to match the demand.
Finally, Jonathan, let's talk cladding. There's been some movement this week from the government in terms of getting freeholders to pay for the remedial work for fire safety. Can you see an end to this crisis anytime soon?
No, I don't. I think that's going to run for years and years and years, not least because it's just a vast volume of work that needs to be done. Across London alone, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of tall buildings that need to have their cladding removed. And it's not just cladding, bear in mind. There's lots of buildings that have other forms of fire defects as well. So all that has to be dealt with. All that has to be sorted out. All those buildings have to be made safe. And the construction sector is already pretty flat out at the moment, finding it difficult to find the resources for just the ordinary course of work. And the fire safety work is actually quite specialist work as well. So it is going to take years. There is more money now available from the government and from the industry to put it right, but still probably not enough. So I don't think we'll see an end to this story probably for another decade. What we're seeing increasingly from the industry is that they are dipping into their pockets now, especially the more reputable major house builders and property developers, especially the UK-based ones that have sort of more reputational risk on the line, I suppose. They are now dipping into their pockets on a much bigger scale to provide funding for the remediation that's needed on the buildings that they were involved with. The trouble is, there's hundreds of buildings around London where the ownership is either a little bit obscure, or foreign owners may be less inclined to put in the funding that's needed to fix the buildings, or offshore companies that it's very hard to work out who the ultimate sort of beneficial owners are. All that makes it a very complex situation. So I think the UK-based industry, yes, definitely a willingness to put things right, but that's not the whole story by any means.
Let's go to the ads. Please do stay there to hear about London's best value neighbourhoods and why the Elizabeth line's set to be a game changer. Why not hit rate and follow in the meantime? Now, we've heard all about the economic forces impacting house prices, but on the ground in London, where are the hottest neighbourhoods offering the best bang for your hard-earned pounds right now? Here's Homes and Property Editor, Prudence Ivy.
Where is hot in London right now? Everywhere is hot in London right now. People have just been buying homes. Still, they're desperately trying to buy, and there's not a lot on the market. So kind of across the board, especially for houses or anything with a garden, is still being snapped up. But we just crunched some excellent data from Savills, which broke down the best value spots in each tube zone. So if people want a kind of a helping hand to make their house hunt slightly more affordable, and we've looked in zones 2, 3 and 4, and we've pinpointed that if you want to buy a flat in zone 2, you could look in New Cross, or for a house, you might be surprised, but Peckham is the best value for money in zone 2, even though it's extremely popular. Looking further out, you've got East Ham, and then in zone 4, it's Ilford's one of the hotspots, as is Thamesmead.
How come these areas are still offering relatively affordable prices? And what's the impact of the Elizabeth line, aka Crossrail?
Well, yeah, as you say, affordable is an extremely subjective term. So we're always really loath to just bandy it around. But yeah, Ilford and Thamesmead both have Elizabeth line connections within them. Thamesmead at Abbey Wood and Ilford in Seven Kings. Instantly, they're just going to find themselves feeling much more central to the heart of London. You know, if all of a sudden you can get to Tottenham Court Road in 20 minutes compared to getting to Liverpool Street in half an hour and then having to get on a tube line, they're instantly going to feel much more part of the heart of London. So I'm sure that will make a big difference in the sort of mid to longer term. But at the moment, because Crossrail has been delayed for so long, that hasn't really affected the prices so much yet. There would have been a little bump when it got announced, but actually they still haven't experienced any of that kind of major high street change that we've seen in so many other parts of London.
And how about the very top end of the market?
The interesting thing, what people are saying in those areas is traditionally they've been really attractive to international buyers, as we know. You know, that's where the money is. It doesn't belong in one country. But actually, since COVID, these markets have started picking up again, but they're largely with British-based buyers who, like the rest of us, want a garden now, and they want to be near a park and green space. And so that's actually quite an interesting shift.
And finally, Prudence, thanks very much for your time. How is the temperature of London's rental market post-pandemic?
There was 2 years respite during the pandemic, but the bad news is that was the time when nobody wanted to live in London. Everyone was either moving back with their parents or they were living sort of somewhere more countryside-y, because that's the nice thing about renting is it's flexible. So you can respond to your current life circumstances to a degree. But sadly, now that everybody's back in London and wanting to live near work, social life that's reopened and all the rest of it, rents are absolutely soaring. It's massively competitive. We're hearing of sealed bids again, open house viewings with sort of 20 people for just any old flat that comes available. This won't last forever, but anyone who remembers, I think it was sort of 2014 or so when the rental market was really, really competitive before in London. It seems like that's back.
There's more on this story in the Evening Standard newspaper and online at standard.co.uk. That's The Leader. We're back on Friday at 4 p.m.